we're carrying on in a series about Jesus is tonight, which has been really cool, hey? Some really good messages recently. So I'm going to kick us off in the book of Leviticus. So we're going to start in Leviticus 25, verses 23 to 28. Okay, so what we're talking about here is the word redeemer. The Bible says Jesus is a redeemer. And the Bible says a lot of times that God will redeem Israel. But the question is, what does it mean? What does redemption mean? And this is the first time we see this idea of redemption in Scripture is in Leviticus. And it's around the laws of the land that God brings into Israel. The idea of redemption is about a purchase, and it's about somebody having a right over something. And I'll say more soon, but let's read together. So let's start at verse 23. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, God, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. If, however, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value for the years since they sold it and refund the balance to the one whom they sold it. They can then go back to their own property. But if they do not acquire the means to repay, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and they can then go back to their property. That's it, hey. So the idea of redemption is such a different mindset towards land ownership and culture and antiquity, what they would call it, is in ancient Israel, that this idea that God brings to the people is the land is not yours to divide and for rich people to own. The land is mine, and you are borrowing my land. You are living on my land, and if I give it to a certain family, it stays that family's because it's God's thing. So there's a strong thing comes through in the culture of family lines and generations. So the word redeemer essentially means to be restored to its rightful owner or restored to its original intended state. So let's look at Ruth, the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. Well, in the book of Ruth, there's this really beautiful story of redemption, if you've ever read Ruth. It's all about redemption. And so let's start in chapter 1. Here we go. And the day when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went for a while to live in the country of Moab. Everybody say, oh no. Bad idea. The man's name was Elimelech, which means God is my king. But he wasn't acting like it. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Oh no. Everybody say, oh no. Yeah, he died. And she was left with her 2 sons. So they married a Moabite woman. Everybody say, oh no. One named Orpah. Was that Micah? Good boy, Micah. One named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. Oh no. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. What a start to a story. So we're gonna carry on to verses 16. We're just gonna skip a little bit of dialogue here, and we're gonna jump to verses 16 to verse 22. So what's happened is Naomi has got absolutely nothing. And in those days, women were essentially absolutely dependent on males to live and survive in their culture. You couldn't have a job, you couldn't own land, you couldn't do anything. So she's stuffed, she's got nothing. Her life is devastated. And what she does is she tries to convince both of the girls to go back to their own families, which they left when they got married. Back in Moab and the towns and villages in Moab. She tries multiple times in multiple ways to convince them. It's not just one conversation. But we start here in verses 16, and Naomi is now talking to Ruth. Okay, so Orpah has finally submitted and finally said, okay, I'll go back. But Ruth is stubborn. And so we come from verse 16 here, and it says, but Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth is determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. That's the last one, eh? Does that sound right to you? Does that sound right? Something sounds off here, eh? So you've got two characters, and they're very different characters. You've got Naomi and Ruth. It's like night and day. Naomi went with her husband Elimelech and left Israel when times are tough. First big sin. You don't do that when you're an Israelite. You don't take refuge in other countries. You stay true to the people of God, to the promised land that He's given you, and you believe that God is going to provide. First big sin. Second big sin, she marries off her children to Moabite women. Bible clearly says that. God clearly said don't marry other women. And they clearly disobey. Third thing she does is she tries to convince them to go back to their old gods and their old life rather than letting them come and live in Israel, which completely misses the point of what Israel was there to do. So Naomi's just got her head in a funny place, and you get a lot of grace for her because she's lost everything. But Ruth was different. Ruth got it. Somehow Ruth the Moabite knew the God that Naomi was supposed to be obeying. She knew this God, and she honored this God, and she wanted to live in the country with the people of this God and serve this God and worship this God. Ruth was incredible. Ruth was so different than what she was supposed to be. She had this heart of just desiring God. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. The Lord deal with me if anything separates us. I mean, she clearly believes in God and God's reality. And yet it's so different because Naomi is here saying, oh, God's rejected me, God's afflicted me, God's taken everything away from me. Whereas reality is they turned their backs on God 10 years before. They turned their back on God and they left the promise, they left Israel, and then all of a sudden, everything falls to pieces. Their whole life turns to custard. Everybody dies, and they find themselves empty, just an empty husk. And it's horrible, and we're not throwing any stones at Naomi, but here we've got two very different characters. Now, on Ruth, I want to bring up Romans 2, verses 14 to 16, because Ruth symbolizes someone to us here. And Naomi symbolizes someone. Naomi here symbolizes the people of God, the Jewish people. She symbolizes people that were given everything and were supposed to follow God, were supposed to honor God, were supposed to worship God, were supposed to shine a light, and yet she did the opposite. She didn't get it, and her heart was just in the wrong place. Whereas Ruth, I think it talks about the Ruth-type people here in Romans 2:14. So let's have a look. Indeed, when the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. And can we bring up the next one? It kind of flows. I skipped out a middle bit. So Romans 2:25. Circumcision has value if you observe the law. Circumcision was a practice, a physical practice, to mark Jewish people as gods. Circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So what's the point in being labeled a Christian or a person of God if you don't follow God with your heart? If your heart's far from Him, your label counts for nothing. Next verse, please. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? It's a bit of a mind bender there, eh? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who even though you have the written code and circumcision are a lawbreaker. A person who is not a Jew and is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is a circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. Circumcision counts for nothing if you are a lawbreaker. And Naomi's Jewish status counted for nothing when she's standing beside Ruth, who's putting her to shame. Ruth is desperately wanting to do what is right, with loyalty and a heart for God. And Naomi is blaming God for turning her back on her and wallowing in self-pity. I wonder who you relate to tonight. I wonder if you were to put yourself in one of these characters tonight. I wonder if there's some of you, maybe you feel like you could relate with Ruth. You've been through absolute hell, and everything has been stripped from you, and things have been taken away from you, and you've just suffered for a long time. I wonder if you can relate with that tonight. So the message here is, don't be like Naomi. Don't turn your back on God, because sometimes when we live a certain way for a long time, like Naomi lived, we forget that we actually are living in sin. Naomi and her husband and her family lived in sin for a number of years. And by the time the wheels came off the car, 10 years later, they were like, why is this happening to me? Why us? Why us? Whereas some of you might feel like Ruth, and there's a little bit of a background here on Ruth, is Ruth would have had some pretty big insecurities going into Israel. Because Ruth was a Moabite. And now to understand a few things about Moabites, Jewish people regarded themselves in their righteousness and holiness and right standing. Now, Moabites came from Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed except for Lot's two daughters, who got their father drunk and had sex with him so that they could carry on their race. And that's where the Moabites come from. The Moabites are seen as disgusting people to the Jews. Ruth is a Moabite. This. Oh, no, it's okay. It's great. Hello. Ruth is a Moabite. She looks different. She comes from a different background. The Moabite king was the one who sent the person to curse the Israelites coming through the wilderness. The Moabites are enemies of the people of God. And somehow this Moabite loves God. And she's got the laws of God written on her heart. But even though she loves God, she looks wrong. She's got maybe the wrong colored skin. Maybe she's got the wrong facial features. Maybe she wears the wrong clothes. And when she comes in to the people of God and to the assembly, she sticks out like a sore thumb. And people look at her and say, why is a Moabite here? And maybe some of you guys tonight, maybe you felt like a Moabite coming into church because you've come into Christian world with Christian people that all look the same and all talk the same. And maybe you feel like you don't look like that and you don't talk like that and that's not your story. Your story isn't this happy, clappy Christian story where everything went well and your parents were really nice and you went to a Christian school. Maybe that's not your story tonight. Maybe you feel more like Ruth because you come from the wrong family, from the wrong country. You look different and you feel different. But I've got good news tonight for you because God used Ruth. And there's a heart, the Spirit writes the law of God on your heart. And God used Ruth. God used Ruth. Not to put Naomi to shame, but he used Ruth when Naomi wasn't stepping up. Naomi wasn't being who she was supposed to be, and the Jews weren't being who she's supposed to be, but God chose Ruth the Moabite. And maybe you feel like a Moabite tonight, but there's good news for you. Because in Romans 5:8, it says that God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And it doesn't matter what your story is, it doesn't matter what your mess is, it doesn't matter what your background is, it doesn't matter what your color is, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what your subculture is or what music you listen to, for Christ demonstrates his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And he died for Moabites like us. And the other good news is if you feel like a Naomi tonight, maybe things happened to you and it just messed with your heart and it messed with your head and you started building a theology around your suffering and you started building excuses around your sin and your behavior because things got tough and you started losing things and things started going wrong in your life. And so you started making excuses around your living and you became a Naomi. And you're supposed to shine a light as a Christian, but you're doing the opposite. You're blaming God. You're wallowing. And maybe you feel like Naomi tonight. But the good news is God demonstrates his love for us while we were still sinners. Christ died for us. And this here is a redeemer. Christ is a redeemer. And there's a redeemer in this story. There's a happy ending to this story. What happens is Ruth and Naomi start walking to Bethlehem. And they get to Bethlehem and they find somewhere to stay. And then Ruth starts gleaning in a field, which means she's picking up the scraps. And as she's picking up the scraps in a field, somebody notices her. And he takes care of her. He says, she looks different. She's a Moabite. What is she doing here? She's suffering. Hey, let's take care of her. Let's give her extra stuff. Starts giving her extra stuff. And then she finds out that this guy's what they call a family redeemer. His name's Boaz. Boaz is the family redeemer. And so what Boaz ends up doing is Boaz ends up marrying Ruth. He ends up marrying Ruth, which is just, it's hard to understand in our context because it doesn't mean much here. You can, as a woman, you can go work at it, you can just go get a job and get a flat and you're okay. But in this context, you couldn't get a flat and you couldn't get a job. You were stuffed. And until someone marries you, you were gone burgers. Everybody say gone burgers. So Boaz redeems Ruth by marrying her. She now has a roof over her head. She now has a husband and a family. He has redeemed her life. And redemption, as we said before, means restored to its rightful owner, restored to its original intended state. What else does he do? He redeems Naomi. Naomi doesn't deserve it. Naomi does not deserve to be redeemed. Naomi is blaming God and complaining about her loss because of her sin. Naomi caused herself to be in her position by her decisions. But what does Boaz do? He redeems Naomi by redeeming Ruth. And tonight, if you are living a life where you feel like you're a Naomi sort of person, I've got great news for you. Because Boaz redeems Naomi, representing Christ redeeming you. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still actively sinning, Christ died for us. While we were spitting in his face, he died for us. He wasn't waiting for you to turn your life around or to start being bitter or to start being good or to start acting like a Christian. Naomi wasn't doing a good job, but Christ died for her and Boaz redeemed her. Can I have the band up? Thanks, band. You guys are great. Do you guys love the band here? Yeah. They're amazing. We've got an amazing band. There's one last piece of the story, kind of takes it to another level. The story sounds like a story on its own, but this story is a puzzle piece in the story of God. In Genesis 12, there's a guy named Abraham, as actually his name is Abram at the time. He's not a Jew. He's from a place called Samaria, from a city called Ur of the Chaldeans. Probably quite a sinful city, probably quite a crazy city. Lots of idols, lots of temples. God calls Abraham. He says this to Abraham. The Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. That's it, hey. So there's a story, there's a promise that God made to Abraham, and it goes beyond the Jewish people. It went through the Jewish people, through Jesus Christ, the Messiah, into a much larger promise. But Ruth, believe it or not, plays a pivotal role here because she is in the genealogy of Christ. And if she wasn't redeemed, we wouldn't have seen the same line that the Jewish people value so much going towards Jesus. And in Ruth 2 verses 10, it says this. Ruth bowed down with her face to the ground towards Boaz. She asked him, why have I found favor in your eyes? I'm just a Moabite. Why are you treating me so well? Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law, how you left your home, you left your father and mother, your homeland, and you came to live with a people that you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Ruth unbeknowingly walked in the footsteps of Abraham. She unbeknowingly repeated the same journey that Abraham walked. And what she did, just following her heart as a Moabite, wanting to serve God, just wanting to love God, and wanting to do what was right, fulfilled the promise that God made to Abraham all those years ago. It was pivotal. And what I want to say to you tonight is you can be a Moabite. You can not fit in. But God, if you give him your heart, if you give God your heart, like Ruth gave her heart to God, if you choose to do what's right and you choose to honor God, he will take your story, which might be a bit messy. It might not be that great. You might be from a really bad family. You might be from a really bad place. You might have grown up in a bad school in a bad suburb, but he will take your story and he will weave it into his story. And he will take your life and he'll weave it into a bigger story that affects history. And you can become a part of this story if you give him your life.